Hi everyone. Before I start sharing my screen and dealing with that, I just wanted to just briefly introduce myself. I'm Sahir Advani. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Maine, but I live and work on the West Coast, in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm just south of you guys, and I had the opportunity to visit Homer, Alaska, maybe a couple of years ago as part of the Local Catch Network Seafood Summit. And so it was a really neat experience. Um, and basically, the work that I've been doing at the University of Maine has been this national survey of the direct seafood marketing sector. So in this talk, I'll be sharing some of the insights at a national scale, but then really focusing down at the very end towards more local, relevant conditions in Alaska and potentially opportunities for folks interested in engaging in direct seafood marketing in Alaska. Um, because a lot of the findings, I'm broadly saying Alaska. Of course, there might be some differences in terms of the logistics and the infrastructure available in Bristol Bay or in Dillingham. So please just note that when I say Alaska, I'm again referring to the entire state, and most of this data is a function of how we receive responses to the survey. Okay, so with that, I'll just share my screen. Yeah, you should be able to see my screen. Taff, could you let me know?
On mine, it says you've started. All right, just came up.
Perfect. Okay. So this national survey was a collaboration between the University of Maine and the Local Catch Network, which is a network of practice really trying to focus on regional and local seafood production in the United States. The survey was funded by the USDA and NOAA Fisheries, and some folks at both these institutions had some inputs into the design of the survey, but beyond that had no access to the data or the raw data and the findings from it. So if there's one thing that I want you guys to take away from today's talk is that the research shows that the most profitable direct seafood strategy is basically diversifying the number of direct marketing channels you're engaged with. I'll get into more details as to what counts as direct marketing, but basically that's the main takeaway. Rather than potentially sticking to one line of direct marketing, it is more economical and potentially more resilient to tackle as many marketing channels as possible to account for differences and fluctuations in markets. Um, Now, the reason I say this is because, at least for the agricultural sector, there's a track record that marketing data helps farmers in the US, across the US, basically um, develop their direct agricultural marketing better. So, uh, data from the agricultural direct sector has helped the USDA provide additional funding and grants to support the direct agricultural sector. Some of that money trickles
It's,
into seafood, but not a whole lot. Um, so
sir,
what we
excuse
try to
me
do
for
with,
interrupting, if I may.
yeah,
Yeah, now was that a recent USDA decision? And is that money available now, or given what's going on in DC and the Trump administration, it seems like money like that has been clawed back. But are you saying
yeah.
that that is something that could be accessed at the present time?
This was not a recent thing. This was data from, I believe, 2022. Um, and we basically conducted another analysis of how USDA supports the seafood sector. And basically it's something like, I'm going to say off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. Something like 0.5% of USDA funding goes towards seafood, and that includes aquaculture and so on, and wild caught. Uh, what that data, and I'm happy to talk about that more in detail later on, we're using that data, folks in Alaska and across the US are using that data to potentially leverage additional support for the seafood sector. Again, it's hard to say how that really plays into the larger narrative that is the current political climate and the administration's targets. But using the executive order on strengthening seafood systems is a valuable way to make the case that seafood needs more financial support.
Thank you.
Okay. And anyone else, please feel free to just jump in anytime. I'll turn my audio up so I can hear you, but it's a little hard at times to hear. So please feel free to interrupt and ask me any questions. So basically, the USDA has been conducting the local food marketing practices survey for years now, and that data has been useful in telling the government that this is the amount of support that farmers need. So that was the incentive for us to produce this survey, for us to be able to say, direct marketing in the direct seafood marketing in the US is really small, and potentially we need more data in order to be able to say this is how much funding needs to be given to this sector in order to help it really thrive. Now, what is direct seafood marketing? I'm sure most people know what it is in this room, but just to give a reminder, it's basically these really shortened supply chains that are meant to identify who the commercial seafood harvesters or the fishermen are that are catching seafood at the time of sales, as well as with most of the economic benefits from those seafood sales going to the harvester. So you can have a variety of different channels where you have, pardon? You can have a variety of different marketing channels, such as direct to consumer, where you have off the boat sales or home deliveries and sales at farmers markets. You can also have direct to retail, direct sales to like a fishmonger or a grocery store or a co-op. Food services, your classic restaurants and seafood shacks and food trucks, as well as institutions, so hospitals and food banks. And then this last category, which was based on focus groups with the seafood sector across the US, where folks said, I sell it to my buyer, my dealer, but he at the point of sales is telling the customer that this fishing vessel caught this seafood or this fisherman caught this catch. So we've basically labeled it as source identified distributors, where it's a company that is buying seafood off a fisherman and then selling it under their brand name, but also identifying this fisherman at the time of seafood sales. I believe in the Alaskan context, there are some custom processors that do that, but please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong there. So ultimately, with all of that in mind, the purpose of this 2023 survey that we conducted was to really understand the scale of the direct seafood sector, the economic value of it, and basically the geography. Where are fishermen across the US engaging in local and direct seafood sales? We did a really preliminary survey to start with, where it was literally a postcard sent to every single commercial fisherman across the US. Many of you probably received those postcards and reminders about responding to those postcards. And that basically helped us get a really initial estimate as to how many folks in the US are selling seafood locally and directly. Basically, what we know from those estimates is that there are roughly 12% of fishermen across the US engaged in some form of direct marketing. It may not be year-round, it may not be to multiple different channels, but they're engaged in some form of direct marketing. But again, this is really limited data. The figure on the right basically shows the different marketing channels that folks were engaging with. And this is data from 3,000 fishermen across the US and just responding to a postcard survey. So there was a lot more that we didn't really have an answer to in terms of what are the economics of it, what seafood is being actually sold, and so on and so forth. That led us to then do a more detailed survey. So basically in 2023, we first contacted 6,000 fishermen across the US who'd either identified themselves as direct marketers, or we knew from their permits that they were. So in Alaska, it would be folks with a direct marketing license, or else a catcher seller would potentially be someone engaged in direct marketing. We had 1,200 or so responses to the survey, with about a 20%, 15 to 20% response rate in Alaska. And then of those responses, a lot of them were just saying, no, I don't engage in direct marketing, or I didn't direct market last year. But basically, we had 600 responses that were valid and we could use to conduct our analysis. And again, this is across the US. For Alaska, the number of valid responses was 63. But that's about 9% or 8 to 10% of our population that responded to the survey. So what we know from this bigger picture survey is that 60% of the direct seafood sector across the US are full-time employees. 19% of this workforce are female, and then 90% of direct seafood businesses are family-owned. Across the different regions of the US, there is a difference in, again, this is data from the survey, so it's not absolutely accurate. It's just estimates that we've received from our survey. But basically, the size of the direct seafood workforce varies by different regions of the US. And so while here it indicates that the West Coast has a pretty large workforce that are involved in direct seafood, I'd probably say that Alaska does too, and has a probably comparable number of folks involved as there are in, say, just Washington or just Oregon involved in direct seafood sales. I'll take a minute to just see if there are any questions in the room before moving on. Okay.
I have a question, Sahir.
Yeah.
Did it specify in the survey about the people who fish in those locations, if they live in those locations as well, or if their home of record is in a different location, or they sell? Was that extrapolated?
No, we didn't do that. I'll be sharing, I think the next figure or two slides down is kind of a map showing the distance that folks are selling their seafood at. One of the other ways that I've been trying to analyze the data from Alaska is beyond just saying beyond just looking at, say, their address, also looking at where a lot of this data was based on the license data. So if they had a license in Alaska, but then had a permanent address or address in say Washington, that data would still be linked to Alaska. So again, in terms of fishing, number of folks and a number of fishing vessels involved in direct seafood sales that responded to the survey, we know that a large number of folks in New England are involved in direct seafood marketing. Again, most of the time these would be folks that are working on as lobstermen and selling lobster directly off their boats or on the docks. But again, in Alaska, there probably is a pretty high number. It's important to remember that Alaska is a state unto itself, whereas a lot of these different bars on this graph are entire regions. So the South Atlantic covers a large stretch of land, as does the Mid-Atlantic versus Alaska, which has pretty big coastline as well. overall, in terms of what products seem to be getting sold the most in or directly marketed, 45% of respondents said that they were selling finfish. 33% was selling crustaceans. So this would be crabs, lobsters, prawns, shrimp, whatever other crustaceans there are. And 17% was selling mollusks and shellfish. So it could be things like octopus, squid, but also things like oyster and clams that were wild harvested and not raised in aquaculture. 36% of direct seafood sold was chilled. And this is again a function of just the larger number of folks responding in the continental USA, where their supply chains are shorter and it is easier to just sell seafood in the chilled form. 32% of seafood was sold as live, and this is often the case from, say, this from Maine and other parts of New England where species like lobster are sold live because that's the best value for the product. And then 17% of seafood that was directly sold was frozen. And this may be a function of just the really long supply chains that are cold chains that are required to keep um, directly sold seafood frozen from the point of processing to final sales to consumer. And so Tab, this was the map I was telling you about, where basically we don't have too many responses from Bristol Bay, but that also might be a function of me trying to anonymize the data as best as possible. And so if there were responses, they've probably been lumped in with other responses just to make it not to identify anyone in particular on this map. But basically, for the most part, a lot of folks were selling less than 100 miles away from where they've either caught or landed the seafood. Some in Alaska, you can see that there's a lot more green being shown up, and that is because a lot of folks would maybe be catching in Alaska and then selling directly in their home states once they head back home. And so that accounts for the larger green distribution on this map, particularly from Alaska. Folks have any questions about this map at this stage?
Yeah, so the greater than 400 could go from Alaska to Washington or something, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, these distances were based closely on the USDA's Local Food Marketing Practices Survey. We wanted to keep this data as comparable to that in order to make the stronger case that while there is all of this knowledge about the agricultural sector, this is what it looks like for seafood. In potentially, if we were to redo the survey, we would try and make more distinct definitions that reflect the conditions for seafood better in terms of how it's marketed across larger distances. And so at a national level, from our direct marketing survey, we know that at least like 70% of folks are engaging in direct-to-consumer sales. And that's that bright red orange bar on the left. After that, the next most popular marketing channel is this category of source identified distributors. So businesses that basically identify the fishermen at the point of final sales. Then you have retail, and after that you have sales to food services, and sales to institutions are lower across the US. But later on, I'll share how in Alaska, a lot of folks seem to be selling direct to institution as well as a way to engage in additional untapped markets. And in terms of revenue, we also had a couple of questions asking folks how much revenue they earned from just direct seafood sales versus their gross revenue for the entire year. And so this is data only dealing with direct seafood sales and the number of businesses that responded to those various income brackets. So basically, for the most part, across the US, that sweet spot or where most businesses seem to be um, having the best income seems to be somewhere in the middle where it's income ranging from 10,000 to about 250,000 in a year from direct seafood sales only. This is across the US. So in Alaska, what it looks like is the most folks seem to be finding that 25 to 50,000 is where they were getting in the most income for the year 2023. Um, yeah. And if folks are curious about other parts of the country, this is what the data looks like. There's a big spike in areas like South Atlantic and New England, and there are lots of businesses that are reporting really high direct sales or really high income from direct sales in some of those regions. It's tough for us to completely validate this data, so take that with a pinch of salt. But what we've then tried to do, and that's some of the analysis I'll be sharing later, is really look at if this is what businesses are reporting, and we know that these are the marketing channels that they're engaged with, which combination of marketing channels potentially yields the greatest income for these businesses. And we
I
really
have
try
a
to tease
question
that
if I
out.
could.
Yeah,
Excuse
I see a
me.
question.
I'm just curious, it looks like you have about 10 or 12 direct marketing businesses earning $5 million or more a year. Do you have any data on what sort of businesses those are? Because I've always thought of direct marketing opportunities as kind of, small operations. These are not small operations.
Yeah. Yeah. So some of them, because we were trying to take a really broad brush stroke approach to what counts as direct seafood marketing, some of those businesses could be large seafood co-ops as well. So like I know like the SPC Seafood Producers Cooperative was also included as part of the folks that we were contacting for this survey. I'm not at liberty to say what their data looked like, but basically you have these really large cooperatives and large businesses that are buying seafood from fishermen at fair prices and potentially marketing it directly that have also responded to the survey.
Thank you.
Okay. But so again, and because of that weirdness where you have these really a few businesses reporting really high data, we've really tried to, rather than just doing a linear kind of analysis saying, oh, these businesses probably are the ones that are the best ones to like look into as to what marketing channels work for them. We've really tried to make the case where we're teasing apart those businesses from others to really understand, in terms of getting higher income, what are the other conditions or marketing strategies that help a business make good income from direct seafood sales. So I'll now start talking about the Alaskan seafood sector. And I want to start with one, flagging that a lot of this data, like when we designed the survey, we started designing the survey in 2022. But because the pandemic was already underway, because there was signals that a lot of folks were either going under or else were not really engaging in seafood or direct marketing the way they did before the pandemic, um, we decided to basically use license data from 2019 in order to start building our database. So any new entrants into the sector post 2020 were not necessarily captured in our survey. Out of curiosity, as I was preparing this talk, I wanted to see what the change in the number of licenses was in Alaska for 2024, and just to see how this, what one would loosely think about the seafood sector in terms of fishing vessels as well as buyers and processors, how's that's changed since 2019 to 2024. And so for the most part, what I'm, at least what this data at a quick glance is showing is that the number of folks engaging in direct marketing and catching and selling seems to have dropped from 2019. But at the same time, the number of folks engaging in as catcher processors, catcher exporters, as well as, say, independent companies and buyers seems to have really increased drastically. And so that's an interesting trend. I don't know what that actually looks like on the ground. So I'm really curious as to what folks think may be happening there. And I'm happy to chat about that later just to get a sense of what might be going on. But from our survey, in terms of the Alaskan context, what we know is that in terms of processing, 35% of folks in Alaska were engaging in self-processing. 30% were selling it to custom processors, and only 18% were not engaged in any processing. And this might have been because they were dealing with live seafood that didn't require it, or they were just selling it directly off the dock, and so didn't have to, beyond filleting it, didn't have to think any further about it. In terms of distribution, 34% were not engaged in any form of distribution. This may be because their buyers were coming directly to the dock to buy it, or else they were selling it directly off the docks. 28% engaged in third-party logistics companies to distribute their seafood. This would be either sales via air to elsewhere in the US, or else other logistics companies that would take the seafood down to Washington and then process it to sell onwards. And 27% were engaged in distribution themselves. And again, this could be them working with companies like Alaska Air to freight the seafood over elsewhere, but again, taking on all of the logistics and the burden of like working out those contracts and ensuring that the seafood was picked up and sent over and so on and so forth. For Alaskans, for the most part, and the ones who responded to our survey, 59% sold seafood less than 100 miles from where they landed it. 5% sold it in this range of 100 to 400 miles, and that's understandable. But basically, then more than 400 miles, that was 33% of folks were selling it more than 400 miles. So to have that kind of answers your question as to what that data looks like. And I'm sure if one was to ask further, is it 400 miles or is it more than that? You'd get some more interesting outputs. In terms of directly sold seafood in Alaska, 31% of folks were engaging in sales of frozen fish. Again, we didn't specifically ask about which species, but it probably is going to be salmon in the case of Alaska for the most part. 25% were selling it either, 31% were selling it as chilled fish, 25% as frozen fish, 15% were processing their fish in the form of cans and selling it on, and 6% of crustaceans were being sold in the frozen form, or 6% of direct seafood sales were frozen crustaceans. In the again, now I'm just repeating this chart here to show that this is what direct-to-consumer marketing channel engagement looks like at the national scale. In the Alaskan context, again, data from 63 folks, 77 or about 78% of folks are engaging only in direct-to-consumer, are engaging for the most part in direct-to-consumer sales, but they may also be engaging in other marketing channels along with that. It's important to note that, again, these percentages won't add up to 100 because folks were tapping into multiple marketing channels. But clearly, direct-to-consumer marketing is a common one for most Alaskan fishermen. So about 10% of folks, like I was mentioning earlier, engage in direct sales to institutions. So that potentially is a promising line of income for direct seafood sales. However, there's very limited data on this. There are only six folks in the Alaskan uh, responses were selling direct to institutions. So we don't have too much data on what the economic benefits are for that. And then beyond that, direct sales to retail was again the next most popular category for Alaskans, followed by direct sales to source identified distributors. So here is kind of where I'll talk through this a bit more before I'll leave this graph on. But basically what we did was we used the revenue data, that the self-reported income from direct sales. We then said, okay, we recognize there are regional differences. And so we want to make sure that we're only considering within region differences in income. So the data shown at a national scale is keeping in mind that there are regional differences. And for Alaska, it's keeping it very focused on what the Alaskan context looks like. We've also then controlled for other characteristics that may influence direct seafood sales. So the types of seafood products being sold, the types of the characteristics of the person, how long they've been fishing, how long they've been engaged in direct seafood sales, whether they're male or female, what ethnicity or race they are, how old they are, in terms of where they are located in Alaska. Like, is it a somewhat urban area or is it a really rural area? Median income, which would be an indicator of kind of the markets that they can tap into at a really local scale. So we've basically controlled for all of that and created this analysis where it's basically saying you have these two fishermen that at the most part look almost identical, other than the fact that they may be engaging in different marketing channels. And based on that, how does that predict what their income levels look like? So long story short, we've compared the advantages of different marketing channels with the reported income from engaging in different marketing channels. And we've tried to control for any other factors that may influence that. So that also means that our sample size from a response rate of 63 for Alaska has dropped down drastically. But we can very confidently say that for folks engaging in either direct sales to source identified distributors or else even to a range of marketing channels such as direct to consumer, retail, food services, and source identified distributors, you're going to have a higher predicted income than if you were just engaging in direct to consumer sales. I know it's not like earth-shatteringly new news to some folks in the room, but this is valuable data for folks like, say, Tav, for him to then potentially provide advice that highlights the need to diversify the marketing channels that you're engaging with, or to identify potentially the ceiling at which you'd reach if you were to engage only in direct seafood sales, and then potentially the next ceiling you'd reach if you were to take on, if folks were to take on additional direct marketing channels to engage with. Yeah, any questions about this? And I apologize if the text is a little unclear to read, so just let me know if you'd like me to kind of spell it out further.
So here, I had a question. Did many of the respondents talk about if they supplement or if this is one of their, if they also sell to like processors, or and this is just like a side thing, or is this
Yeah.
their main source?
Yeah. A lot of folks were talking about how this is a side source of income. So it would be unrealistic to expect someone to be only making like less than 50,000 uh, in a year on just direct seafood sales and managing to keep that business afloat and deal with all the costs of gear and vessel upkeep in just that context. So a lot of folks are supplementing their income, but only in the context of direct seafood sales. This is what the data tells us. Cool. Okay. And so again, and just repeating this point again, that for folks engaging in direct seafood sales, the most profitable strategy uh, in terms of income from direct sales is engaging in multiple different marketing channels. Direct to consumer marketing only gets a direct marketer so far, and adding on additional marketing channels, it does add on additional complexity and logistics, but adding on those additional marketing channels helps really increase the revenues that folks might be wanting to tap into. Um, if folks are interested, we've produced a range of fact sheets. They're mostly at the national level, but they have data on basically high level findings from the survey. I thought there was going to be a QR code, but I guess it's not showing up on this particular slide. So I'm happy to share the link to that later on. We also have the anonymized data from the survey available if folks are interested in checking it out. And I'm happy to basically share those links with Tab later on. With that, I just really want to thank folks for listening to me today. This has been a really big project. Like it took trying to conduct a national level survey using just mails, like mailing letters for the most part, and then some level of online responses. Took a lot of effort in terms of just gathering all the data as well as just conducting the survey. So we have a large team of folks that helped make it happen, as well as lots of advisors from USDA and NOAA Fisheries that provided critical input early on in the survey that helped us potentially develop the survey better. Awesome. With that, do folks have any questions or yeah.
I have another, but I don't want to bogart the questions if other folks have questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In your survey, was there any option for seafood that was given out for donation? Like how much of that was donation?
No, we didn't include that. I wish we did, and we were encouraged to do that by folks in Alaska and Hawaii. When we were finalizing the survey, it had become really long. And so we had to take strategic decisions in making it slightly shorter and more manageable. And so that was one of the questions that we had to unfortunately remove. But we are looking further into that in terms of what level of seafood is being donated and given to local food banks, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah. Could I ask why you were asking that question? Is there an interest in engaging in that kind of marketing channel or yeah.
Food sovereignty and food security reasons mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah, part of an organization that is working towards and has distributed salmon for food security and sovereignty. And so I was just curious about that.
Yeah. I know one of the folks that we're working closely with, Elizabeth Dubowski, who works for I think the project she was working on was called Feeding Change, which is basically really trying to promote Alaskan food sovereignty with the redistribution of salmon across communities in Alaska.
Could you repeat that, please?
So
The name and organization?
Elizabeth Dubowski. I believe she is now with the Alaska Sustainable Fisheries Trust. I know her email address is feedingchangeak@gmail.com, but I'm happy to email her exact email address to Tab or share it with you later if that's
Perfect, that would be
okay.
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I got it here. Contact.
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, Elizabeth, I think, has been doing this work up in Alaska for quite a while now.
Any more questions from other audience members? Dan, if you're trying to talk, I can't hear you. Well, my other question was, I was curious about, were there any questions about infrastructure and what was most beneficial for creating opportunities for direct marketing? And yeah, what people utilized and what was the most bang for the buck, basically, for infrastructure.
Yeah. No, there weren't any questions in the survey about that. We only asked about processing and distribution. We were developing a follow-up set of interviews or like basically reaching out to folks who respond to the survey to ask them about infrastructure related questions in terms of what was beneficial or what were barriers in terms of direct marketing. That was part of a grant that we'd submitted to the Saltonstall Kennedy grant this last year. Unfortunately, that grant program got shut down. So we don't know what the outcomes of that grant will ever be. So there's interest in following up and getting more information on it, but we've been, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Are there follow-up plans for next stage or going deeper?
There are, but again, we want to be cognizant that we don't want to be pestering fishermen too much with too many surveys over and over again, because I'm sure folks deal with surveys all the time. So potentially either working with Sea Grant offices to produce smaller, more focused surveys, or else a follow-up survey several years down the line. So I wonder if I could ask about basically that change in the number of licenses that I'd shared earlier, and see what folks had thought might be going on in that case. Between 2019 and 2024, the number of direct marketer vessels has almost halved. The number of catcher seller vessels has reduced a little bit, but then at the same time, the number of catcher processor, catcher exporters, and buy exporters is pretty much doubled. So is that just based on how, say, flexible the license is, or is there something else going on that I'm missing?
I'm hoping
one
Fritz
thought,
will
if I
answer.
could. My
Yeah.
turn? You talked about the people who are actually making money in this business are those who have diversified companies and some sort of, bigger operations. And I know from my own experience as a direct marketer of vessel that you really need to sell a lot of fish to make any money doing it. And it may be that in 2019, I'm trying to remember, what kind of a season do we have here in 2019? That was a really hot year, as I recall. And or maybe prices were low enough so that it seems that interest in direct marketing is in direct proportion to the price of fish. The better the price of fish is, the fewer people want to do it. But it may be that those who jumped in and had it, gave it a shot, in 2024, decided that it wasn't working for them. In 2024 was, at least in Bristol Bay, was 1 year after a really low price, a base price of 50 cents. And that doesn't give you enough money really to, to do anything extra. Just a thought. I don't know if those are all the reasons.
Yeah, it probably would have been more appropriate for me rather than taking these snapshots to also just look at overall trends across time. But I was just curious as to what did the current picture look like. So yeah. I do want to add this caveat that what we're trying to say with this data is that it's not bad to just engage in direct to consumer marketing. Like clearly there are economic benefits from doing so, and it also is just a function of how much one, fish you can catch, and two, how much you can actually handle and manage in terms of being able to direct market it yourself. But if folks were interested in diversifying, there are some marketing channels that seem to be more profitable than others, and they may want to consider that when they're balancing the pros and cons between engaging in additional marketing channels.
Well, thank you, Sahir. I appreciate it. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing this research and taking the time to present it.
Yeah, no, more than happy to. Some of this data has been published or is on the verge of being published. One of the other things I'd mentioned earlier was that we'd recently conducted a review of all of USDA's grant making activities between 2018 and 2023, so a 5-year period. And basically, again, with that, we're seeing that there's a really small proportion of funding that's going to support wild caught fisheries in particular. I know folks, including Elizabeth Dubowski, including the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, are basically, this was maybe a month ago, they were in DC camp highlighting this data with congressional staffers to say that clearly more support needs to be given to the direct seafood sector. Or just to basically USDA needs to be doing a greater job in supporting wild capture fisheries. So consistent and potentially louder voices echoing this could help make the case for more funding support from the government to strengthen US seafood systems.
And Alaska in particular.
And Alaska in particular, yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Awesome.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. And at the moment, we don't have any more lunch and learns planned for the near future. But as I said, there is the direct marketing training that starts on October 20th with spaces still available all online after the workday. And if folks are interested in talking about infrastructure and resource availability for Dillingham or Naknek or any of Bristol Bay, please reach out to me.
Tab,
Yeah.
is that program going to be a little more nuts and bolts about how to get into it?
Yeah, so that's over 5 days, and they break it down into different locations and different specifics of regulation requirements and international markets, local markets. Yeah, it's very nuts and boltsy.
Pretty good.